Saddle hunters, our brothers over at Tethered continue to kill the game by releasing innovative products. They just recently put out the Eberhard Series saddle. They also put out the Menace saddle, which is for our Husky brothers and sisters that are into saddle hunting. That saddle will do just maybe a little bit better job of cupping your quote unquote assets. But the thing that I'm most excited about is their recent release of the Tethered One climbing stick. This thing is crazy light, crazy strong, and crazy quiet. I'm just going to cut to the chase here and give you some specs. Each stick weighs in at less than 1 pound. That includes your Dynalite rope attachment. A 3-pack of these will weigh in at 2.7 pounds, which is ridiculously light. It's a 17-inch step-to-step single stick height, and there's an 8.5-inch step footbed, which gives you plenty of room for those of us folks with bigger feet. It's all made with aerospace grade titanium and aluminum for construction. So if you'd like to learn more about Tether's innovative products, head over to tetherednation.com and check them out. The first thing I do in the morning before a hunt, before a scout, or just before getting ready for work is have my morning coffee, and I'm sure most of you out there listening are the same. Make sure you're filling your mug with Skull Brew coffee, as it is the only coffee company that is both 2% for conservation certified and donates 10% of its profits to conservation organizations to help secure the future of our wild places. So head to skullbrewcoffee.com and choose between 3 killer roasts of coffee and know that you are supporting conservation with every sip. Welcome to the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast, brought to you by Skull Brew Coffee Company. I'm your host, Clint Campbell, and you're listening to episode number 198. Today I'm joined by Steve Sherk as we are cranking up another DIY Report mini-series, this one all about hunting mature mountain bucks. So stay tuned. All right. What is up, everyone? Happy Wednesday to you. Hope you're doing well. Hope you are feeling fine. If you just opened, because Pennsylvania statewide open or just opened this past weekend, I hope you guys had some success, or at least at a minimum, had an opportunity to get out and enjoy some of the nice weather. Man, we've been having, I can't remember, I guess it's probably been a couple years since we actually had a nice, good, solid, kind of cooler, coldish kind of opening weekend. If I'm remembering correctly, I want to say it was like 3 years ago. We had a great opener for the weather, as far as the weather was concerned. I had a chance to get out this weekend and hunt in a particular spot. I was just kind of waiting until the temperatures kind of got right, and of course the wind was right to slip into this one area that I hadn't been into since the summer. I checked cameras in there. I want to say, man, it might have been late June, early July, I think. And there was one deer in there particularly that looked like he was, had potential. It was so early that I couldn't really tell. It was one that you definitely want to watch. And he's on camera in there. This was an area in close to one area was a primary scrape that I found that's getting a lot of activity still when I checked the camera. And then another area was a bedding area, and I slipped into the corner of this bedding area. Didn't see anything on this particular hunt, but the trail camera data that I got, the card pull that I did was promising. That deer is in there, and he's a good deer. Put it this way, I'd be hard pressed not to shoot him. Even hunting some other Midwestern states, he's that nice of a deer. So hopefully I'll be able to catch back up with him at some point. I actually went in, PA, you can't hunt on Sundays except a handful of Sundays they've allowed us to hunt this year, I think, as a trial run. So yesterday, I'm recording this on Monday, actually today. I actually went in and did a kind of a camera purge, because there was a bunch of cameras I hadn't checked yet. So I went and checked those, and I did a little bit of scouting in a few areas to try to put some puzzle pieces together and begin to make a game plan here for October. Because for me, October is really all I have in Pennsylvania for the most part, because I travel, at the end of October into November. And so I usually only have a handful of weeks in October to try to get things done here in Pennsylvania. So with that, we're going to just kind of jump into today's podcast and have a short upfront here. I do want to make mention, though, before I kind of tee up this podcast, Skull Brew Coffee Company is still running the special a deal on coffee for the opener. Use the promo code OPENER20 to get yourself some kick-ass coffee. Don't drink shitty coffee during hunting season. It's just not worth it. It's not good. So head over to skullbrewcoffee.com and use the promo code OPENER20 and save yourself a little cash. So today on the podcast, have a really cool show for you today. Steve Sherk. I'm sure a lot of you out there have probably heard of Steve. He's a gentleman who's from Pennsylvania. he does some guiding on some public lands in the western part of the state, in and around the Allegheny National Forest. I kind of mentioned in this podcast a little bit. A lot of people will talk about PA not having great deer, and that's certainly the case in certain pockets. But I would say on the whole, the deer are getting better and better in Pennsylvania as far as I can remember from growing up. And if you know anything about Steve, if you ever followed him on Instagram or anything like that, the guy has deer on camera that um, you would be willing and proud to shoot in Iowa or any other Midwestern state. He gets on absolute giants. And he's been doing it for years. And he's got a system as to which, how he kind of goes about doing it, primarily hunting a lot of bedding. And he's got kind of a specific way that he likes to do that. And so what I asked Steve to do when he and I got together, we knew we wanted to do a podcast together. And, what I wanted to do was I didn't want to just talk about mountain bucks in general, because I think there's been, some podcasts out there that kind of do that. And I've certainly done them on this show. But what I wanted to do with Steve that I thought would be helpful, when we're talking about big woods and mountainous kind of terrain, is break it down by season. What types of things is he focusing on, or is he finding success with, based on the time of year, and how does he hunt the mountain, or suggest to the people who come to him to be guided, how does he suggest they hunt the mountain during the different times of the year? As we all know, the deer woods changes, basically from now through, late season, or through the end of December-ish, definitely through the end of November, almost on a day-to-day or every other day basis. And so, in places where you have such large tracts of land like Steve hunts and that Steve guides on, how do you kind of adapt for that? And how do it's maybe a little easier if you're dealing with, places that have a lot of structure and stuff like that, to where you have really defined kind of movements, lines of movement and travel. And when you get into these kind of big wood settings and these mountain settings, you just don't have a lot of that. And so, I wanted to understand how he kind of goes about that and how he's adapting over time as the season changes. And so that's really what we talk about. And this is a 3-part series with Steve, where we're really going to talk about early season, pre-rut and rut, and then some late season stuff. And in this episode specifically, what we start to get into, is how he's hunting bedding during early season. This is the early season session, how he's hunting bedding during early season, how much he's relying on cameras in these places, what he's looking for, or how the wind plays during this time of year, how foliage is playing a role, not just in bedding and as the foliage shifts, but also how that might help or determine, go back to some of the stuff we talked about with Dan. When you have a lot of foliage up, what is that doing with the wind, because that is ultimately a barrier, and so forth. So we talk about all this stuff with Steve during this session. So with that, I'll go ahead and get jumped into the podcast. As always, I want to thank you all for listening. All right, folks, we are back. You are listening to another episode of the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. And today I have on a fella that I've wanted to have on for a while. Some of you may know him. He's made a few of the circuits on some podcasts, especially with my buddies over at Exodus. This is a gentleman where, if you've ever heard the claim that Pennsylvania doesn't have any big deer, this gentleman might be able to throw that claim in the trash. I'm talking to none other than Mr. Steve Sherk. What's going on, Steve?
Not much. Just preparing to talk deer hunting with someone I've been looking forward to for a long time now.
Yeah, I know, man. It's been a long time coming. We ran into each other while we were at Harrisburg. I've been following along with what you've got going on out in your neck of the woods, because you're, I know you're out in more of the northern part of the state. And I first learned of you from our mutual friends, Chad and Jake over at Exodus. And,
okay.
It was, I don't know, probably like a year ago or a year or so ago, whenever you did the first podcast you did with them. And, I've run into a few big deer here and there in Pennsylvania that I've seen. I grew up in, central PA, where, and you and I are probably relatively close to the same age. I grew up in the 90s, and there weren't a whole lot of big deer around, particularly where I was living. And then once I was able to venture away from there, it's like I started, seeing some bigger deer. And especially once I got into like more bed hunting and, hunting some more challenging areas and stuff like that, I started finding, more mature deer and stuff like that. But then I ran across you with those guys, and I was just like, holy smokes. I was like, man, it's like, I've never seen anything like that in Pennsylvania until this year. Actually, I glassed up a couple one that's a legit big deer that would be big in any state that I found. But you're just getting on them consistently, and you're doing it in tough conditions, in the mountains, in big woods, that I've had some experience with those setups and stuff like that. And they're just some of the most challenging areas you can hunt, and you do it with consistency, not only for yourself, but you're helping put other people on deer. So before we get started with all that, because I said a lot about you without saying a whole lot about you. If you wouldn't mind, give folks that are listening a little bit of background about, who you are, where you're from, and what you do for a living, and then also in the whitetail space.
Okay. Yeah. So, I grew up here in, right outside of Bradford, Pennsylvania, in McKean County. I've lived here my whole life. I, I, when I say I grew up in Bradford and, McKean County area, I kind of lived more like on the outskirts of town, even though Bradford's not a big town, but I pretty much grew right in the middle of the Allegheny Mountains, where if you don't deer hunt and fish and do those kind of things, like, you're never going to enjoy life. So I didn't have a choice to really do anything but, hunt and fish. But early on, deer hunting kind of took a big part into my life. And, as I got older, I got more and more into it. And out of high school, as much as I loved deer hunting, I didn't start guiding then, but I started my own landscaping business, which I've been doing pretty much since right out of high school. I'm 34 now, so that's like, 13, 14 years. Then I got into guiding over 7 years ago now. I started guiding grouse. I didn't even ever plan to guide grouse. Kind of long story short is I wrote an article about grouse hunting because I used to do some writing for the local newspaper and a magazine here in PA. But so I wrote an article about how good the grouse hunting was around here, and next thing you know, everyone was emailing me and calling me, wanting me to take them grouse hunting. So I became a guide there, but it only took a couple years, and I enjoyed the guiding aspect of it, but it was just, grouse has never been anything I've been real passionate about. So I was like, you know what, if I'm going to guide, I want to do something or guide something that I really enjoy. So I got into the deer guiding part, and it's kind of been one of my, I guess I would say, one of my best moves I've ever made in life. It's just a side business, but it's really something when you can, do something as part of your career that, you wake up in the morning and you're not dreading going to work. It's the complete opposite. I'm just dying to get out there, and it gets me out more in the off season, and so I guess that's pretty much where I'm at right now. Just landscaping, spring, summer. I do snow plowing in the winter, and then I fit the guiding in more in hunting season. But I'm sure, as you can see, you follow me on social media, I'm in the woods just about every day. So
Yeah. You're probably in the woods as much as anybody I know, if not more. But the interesting thing is, though, is like whenever people hear the term, like, you're guiding and stuff like that, this isn't like a typical setup with like a, big tract of like owned and managed property. Like, you're doing this on what the good Lord gave us, essentially, right? Like, that's, so talk a little bit about that, because this isn't like, I don't want people to get the misunderstanding that this is some managed farm or something like that. This is a complete opposite of what that is.
Yep. I live in a place that's just like, I'm just extremely blessed because there's public land everywhere. A lot of people that know me think that it's just Allegheny National Forest, which I live pretty much right in the middle of it. But then there's a ton of other public land up here that's owned by oil and timber companies. There's just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres of public land. And so I can actually say that I've never once in my life hunted private land. I've never, never scouted, never did anything but on public here. And it's right in the Allegheny Mountain Range. It's all big woods. I might make it look like there's a giant behind every tree, but I can promise people that that's not the way it is. Like, I'm all for people coming up here, giving it a try and even doing it on your own. But in, a big wood setting like this, you definitely got to know what you're doing and put your time in ahead of time, or else it's going to be way more challenging than what it already is.
Yeah, there's definitely a learning curve when it comes to that. And so the cool thing about what Steve and I are doing today is, he's got this interesting perspective of hunting this public piece, guiding it, big woods, big timber, mountain bucks, if you will. And, in talking, he and I decided we should do a 3-part series, and kind of talk about how you hunt these, this particular type of terrain and habitat during the different sections of the season. So what you're listening to right now is really part number 1 of this, where we're going to really talk about, how Steve kind of gets into early season, how he hunts the early season, especially whenever it comes to big woods. Because I think a lot of folks that might be hunting smaller public parcels, or even if they're hunting, their family farms or whatever, you're playing a pretty obvious, a lot of times bed to food pattern and stuff like that. And in the big woods, you don't necessarily always get that. But before we get into those specifics, let's start with the preseason, just a little bit of the off season. Like, what does your prep look like in the off season? Through like, just say up through like this time of year where we get into like late summer, to get yourself prepared for a year.
Sure. Well, I'm sure you can obviously see that I run, quite a few cameras. I ran like 30 to 40 cameras this summer, kind of spread out through, a lot of different areas. And yeah, I'm just like anyone else trying to get inventory. Some bucks I knew survived the season, but, I wanted to make sure they were still around, this summer. And also seeing, some of those younger 2 and 3 year olds last year that looked like they had potential. I wanted to see what they were going to turn into. So, obviously right now we're still kind of in that inventory stage, but we're just about ready to, flip the switch and go into that transition period when, bucks start breaking the bachelor groups. The velvet's going to be, coming off any day. And then that's when, I always say things start to get really crazy in the whitetail world. So, but yeah, so, like I said, overall, the summer is more about inventory, but then going into early season, in this type of situation, I can't even ever say that I've ever had a situation where I patterned a buck early season like bed to food. It's extremely difficult to do something like that, in the big woods. Early season, though, I really think your best bet up here is to try to get close to bedding. But that's easier said than done too, because it's all mountains, and I've talked about it before. But the problem in mountains is finding consistent wind. So you want to get as close to that bed as you can, but then you get too close, and then he's going to smell you during those wind shifts. So the early season's really a challenge up here, but I still think you got to know where a buck is bedded, and you got to find what I call like the safe zone, like. Maybe I wouldn't call that his actual bedding area, but kind of like right on the fringe where you're going to catch him. More than likely, I've had more luck in the afternoon or evenings around bedding than morning. But I think that's just got to be the focus. I don't really focus on trying to catch a buck on a feeding pattern at all. Up here in the early season.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because the big challenge is, like, at least in my humble opinion, the limited opportunity I've had to hunt big woods is just like that pattern ability. Unless you happen to be in an area that has some type of significant structure created by cuts or something like that, to where you can start to dictate a little bit of movement. Like even their movement, in my opinion, is super. I mean, they have a rhyme and a reason why they're doing it, but it just seems very shotgun to a human eye.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Which makes it really hard. So I'm curious, when you're talking about these bedding areas, right, and finding where these are at, and we'll dive into that a little bit more specifically here in a second. But early part of the year, are you focusing on trying to find those known bedding areas that might have like a handful of oaks in or something like that, that might have like the food of that time of year that's going to be prevalent, to know that, all right, they're going to be concentrated more so in this bedding area because I know that there's some white oaks that are going to be dropping. Are you playing that game at all?
Yep. No, I actually am. And it's something, though, that you can't, kind of like you said, I can't bank on that scenario every year because you can't count on mass to produce every year. But I've already got a couple spots picked out, like where almost the bedding and the feeding is kind of in the same area. Like you could find just a real thick, brushy oak point that, if you think about it, early seasons, a time when a mature buck is probably moving as little as any other time of the year. So if he can pretty much lay there all day, get up a little bit, maybe he goes 100 yards and feeds and lays back down. But if you can find that scenario, I think it's could be a really great tactic. But in the big woods too, it's not like you have your own property and you can kind of create the bedding, create the food, and plant it where you want to be. It's the big woods. It's just like it's so it's so unpredictable because whatever's there is there, and you can't control the food, you can't control the bedding. So that kind of makes it the challenge to find like the perfect scenario.
Mm-hmm.
But the good thing is if you do your scouting and you do your homework, the bedding areas are what's most consistent here. Like most of the buck bedding areas that I know of have been buck bedding areas for like at least 5 years. Even it might be like a 10-year-old cut that they're bedding in, but that cut will be good up till it's 20 years old. And it doesn't, even if it starts to open up a little bit, it doesn't have to be extremely thick. I tell people, in fact, I find more deer bedding in the 15 to 20-year-old stuff than I do the 5 to 10-year-old stuff. So, like you really gotta you gotta put your time in for the early season. And we're not talking about postseason yet, but the postseason is the best time to find those bedding areas. Unfortunately, if you're going to go out there in September and October and start bumping those deer and then figuring it out, you're really probably causing more harm than good for yourself. So you got to definitely key in on bedding in the big woods, in my opinion, if you want to have early season success.
Right. So again, from the limited experience I've had in the big woods, bedding is like I was saying earlier, can be somewhat challenging to find just because their movement is unpredictable, I guess, if you will, because there is a lack of structure, and so figuring out when they're moving in a certain direction where they're going to end up is sometimes hard. So, are there any classic areas that you kind of I'm trying to think how to say this, that you historically or that you consistently will find bedding areas? Like for an example, right? It's like if I'm headed to a new public piece, it's like, and I have some terrain, which, I would in your neck of the woods, I would probably first go to like those military crests, leeward side, upper 1/3, you know what I mean? And kind of run that kind of elevation around these ridges to try to figure out, like, is there, a thermal effect that's happening in this particular area that's creating a bedding opportunity? Are you seeing any of those types of trends where you're hunting?
Oh yeah, all of what you said. I see. It's not always like consistent as far as I know a buck's going to bed on this side of the hill because the wind's doing this and the thermals are doing this. Sometimes I see things like that, but the most consistent things are the bucks, especially mature bucks, and even does too. But really, if you want to key in on buck bedding, 90% of the buck beds are like right next to an elevation drop. It's not like, and it doesn't even have to be like the steepest drop, but they bed right on the edge of those drops. They're almost always in cover or right outside of cover. Ridge scenarios. It's not like as soon as you start getting like if you get like on the big flat of a mountain, like bedding disappears. So it's mainly it's kind of easy, I want to say, to locate bedding because, like I said, if you get you get on the topos ahead of time, you find those upper elevation drops, then you can even get in on the satellites sometimes and find the cover. Like almost every thick ridge that up high where there's good elevation breaks will have some buck bedding on it. Now it may not always have a buck that you want to shoot, but as soon as you get away from those areas or those scenarios, the bedding just pretty much disappears. So it's not that hard to find, in my opinion.
Right. Now you said something earlier, like, so say you find one of these, brushy ridges or, whatever the case is, and there's a bedding area. How are you setting up to hunt that? Like, are you hunting it pretty aggressive? Are you getting right in on the bed? Or are you sitting back a little bit? Cause I know, in that mountain terrain, man, like the wind will play some serious tricks on you. You know what I mean? And it's hurt me more times than it's helped me in the past. So I'm just curious about how aggressive you are and how close you'll try or how tight you'll try to get to that bed.
Yep. Almost any early season setup, like, is probably on average 200 yards from a bed or bedding area. And if it's not too early, I'll get into kind of, how I approach those areas. It's not more like I'm one of those guys that's like a hang and hunt kind of guy. Like almost all my hunting decisions are based on what I'm seeing on my cameras, and so I'll cluster cameras around those bedding areas, and then that's what I try to find. I try to find routes in and out of the bedding where it seems, a little more consistent. Like I might have 8 cameras around a bedding area, and I've gotten in a month maybe a particular buck on all 8 cameras. But those 2 or 3, say like on the west side, that I've seen them 50, 60, 70% more. Like that's kind of what I'm, focusing on.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll always have like on one of those routes, if there's not a scrape there already, I always make a mock scrape, because it's like, I'm not saying a scrape is going to be the way to kill any buck, but you'd just be surprised, like, especially you get a little bit further into October and bucks really, start keying in on, working scrapes. Like a lot of bucks that I've killed in October have, or majority of them have come to that scrape, just because it's the closest scrape from their bed, really. And a scrape in mid to late October is probably more on a buck's mind than even food, or possibly even does. So I truly think, that little type of tactic, the getting in the right distance from bedding, not too close, not too far, getting a buck conditioned to knowing, that scrape's there, and the right day when all goes right, it can be a killer setup.
Nice. And are you hunting that scrape then? Like, are you setting up?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So you're setting up with an opportunity to shoot to that scrape.
Absolutely. Yep. And I've killed, I've probably killed 7 or 8 bucks in that same exact scenario, like that scrape just outside of bedding.
Right. And is that scrape, or when you're making that, are you kind of, making sure it's up against some type of security cover, side cover type of thing, to where, they're going to feel it's not out in the open, I guess is what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah. Or if it is, it's right on, it's like no more than 20 yards from the thick stuff.
Got it.
Problem is, like, on public land, you can't do a lot of trimming. So if I want to get in the cover and get good shooting opportunities, you have to do more cutting than what you're really allowed. So most of the time I'm back out on the edge, just outside the edge. And you'd be surprised, like a lot of people don't talk about this, and you'll find in bedding areas, you'll find trails coming in and out of them. And that's what I'm looking for. Different trails coming in and out of the bedding area, and then I'll put the mock scrape, if there's not already a scrape, right on top of the trail, and I'll get most of the time right on the edge of bedding. And sometimes I might have 3 or 4 mock scrapes too. Maybe not every one of those cameras will be a mock scrape, but I'll kind of mix it up. Mm-hmm. And but like I said, if I didn't kill the buck actually working the scrape, you could tell that he was coming right to it. It's just honestly, it's probably my go-to tactic for killing deer in this area.
Nice. Yeah, I've started just recently, probably in the past like 2 years, more specifically probably this year, using more and more mock scrapes. I'll first kind of go in and try to hang a camera and just get good deer inventory movement on a camera. And then once I know that I have movement and deer are using a particular area, then I'll kind of juice it with a mock scrape. And that way I know, it's a place. I'm not trying to pull deer away from where they're naturally at. I'm trying to just enhance the things that they're already doing, I guess is how I'm looking at it. So that's cool. I'm glad to hear that you're having some success, because hopefully it'll translate for me this year.
Sure.
As
yeah,
well.
It can, and it doesn't even have to be big woods. I really think that certain times of the year, those kind of things work really good. And one other thing I'll mention too is a lot of times I find, especially if it's like what I believe is the dominant buck of the area, mm-hmm. like I won't find a lot of other bucks going in near around his beds unless he's been out for a few days. But right on the edge of that cover is where other deer will come through. Like it's almost like deer attempted to just check out to see if that buck's been around, or so it's like a spot where that buck also wants to come out, because he knows he hasn't been bothered a lot inside closer to his bed. So when he'll come out, and he'll even want to see, okay, well, what does are in the area, what other bucks, has he got competition? So finding that actual, that edge there can lead to not only maybe more opportunities with that particular buck, but it's a spot where other deer have become attracted to as well.
Right. Yeah, just kind of sweetening the area just in general.
Yep.
But so
Exactly.
you mentioned a few minutes ago, shifting bedding, how beds will shift, right,
Yep.
from season to season. So if
Yep.
if you're finding a bedding area in October, and this might be getting ahead of ourselves a little bit as we might look toward pre-rut and rut, but like, what is the reason that you see, those beds shifting in the big woods? Because I'll see some of that or recognize some of that just from like wind shifting, and they'll shift really small. Like they'll still be in the same general bedding area, but they might shift like the
Yep.
different side of the point that they're on. But are you
Yeah.
seeing even larger shifts of bedding happen in your area?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I don't want to make it sound like when you find a buck's bedding area, that's the only ridge he's bedding on in the big woods, because he might have 3 ridges that he's bedding on in a mile stretch,
Mm-hmm.
which makes it really, really challenging. So that's where you got to hope that maybe you'll intercept another good buck in that area, or hopefully there is more than one buck in that area that you'd shoot. And I don't know if it's always the wind, but big woods deer, just in their genetics and in their blood, like they're roaming animals. Like even outside of the rut, I've seen a buck, a mile or two away in a different, what I believe is a different bedding area, even in the early season. So, I mean, that's why I do like the early season, but then again, like I think in the mountains, big wood scenarios, the early season may be the hardest. It's probably your best chance to kill one particular buck, but to really nail a buck down, a lot has to go into your favor to make it happen, because he might have three ridges that he's bedding on, and you're not going to know which one to hunt on any given day.
Right.
So, and it's not always based on food wise shifts. I just think it's more like they just have a tendency to want to move around a little more in the big woods.
Right. I think the one thing that people overlook too, is especially whenever they have a lot of options, right? If you're hunting small parcels and there's just a lot of small fragmented parcels around you, it's like there's probably one primary bedding area that has the best of the best, right? And that's where he's going to want to stay unless he gets moved out of it or if there's something significant that changes. But when you're dealing with bigger parcels, man, it can be something as simple as the species of tree that's in his primary bedding area drops leaves before another area. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
To where it's like now all of a sudden he feels a little bit more open. And this secondary bedding point, for example, leaves there is a different species of tree, and so they hold for an extra 3 weeks or something like that, to where now that becomes his cover, right? Do you see some things like that as well?
Oh yeah, definitely. I'll see, like, I don't see a lot of bedding shift to leaf change until like later October or right around the rut, but things like that do happen. Plus, you've got so many other things in public land, like all of a sudden it might get more hunting pressure. That'll cause them to shift. You might have forestry work or oil activity. But the good thing is it may, because this might not apply to ag land or something like that, is there's so much good bedding habitat out there that he's probably not going to go 5-10 miles away. Rather, maybe if there was a big section of farmland somewhere and there was just a little 10-acre wood lot and then 5 miles of field surrounding it, that buck, he's going to go 5 miles to a new section of woods. So here, you can probably still stay in his area pretty easily, but like I said, the problem is always knowing where he's bedding. Like that's the biggest challenge, because he's got so many options here.
Right. And speaking of kind of knowing where he's bedding, I mean, I know you cast, a pretty wide net when it comes to using cameras. You run a lot of cameras. How much are you relying on cameras, either as, do you use them at times for, MRI or most recent intelligence, or are you more so playing the long-term game with your cameras where you're looking more at, annual data to plan specifically for early season?
It's probably a little bit more based on what I saw last year rather than so many times. And I don't want to, I don't want to tell someone that all of a sudden, you check your camera in the week prior. I mean, you just had tremendous intel not to hunt there, but I see so much changing and shifting in the big woods that I'm more focused on watching that area for a year or two and giving it weeks upon weeks of observance to really see what happened rather than like one, magical week doesn't mean that the next week in that location is going to be just as good. A lot of times in the big woods, you'll have spots, they go on and off. Like a few days, you'll have a little 3-day stretch. Maybe one particular buck was bedding in that area for 3 days, and then he shifted over to that other ridge for 3 or 4 days. So you really, you can also hurt yourself sometimes by, basing, last week's intel. But then again, you also can't not hunt there either. But
Right.
you can't really rely too confidently that that's what's going to happen. What you see today and what happened last week might not be tomorrow's activity.
Right. So, I'm curious to ask you this question because I have an experience. I guess I just want to see if my experience is matching up with what your thoughts are. So, how much are you scouting versus hunting during the early part of the year?
I'm actually scouting way more than hunting.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I know that the early season is a really good time once again to focus on a particular buck, but I'm more of one of those guys that I'd rather scout 80% and hunt 20%, and I'd rather hunt the days that I feel are going to be the best days, such as like a cold front or weather related conditions that get deer moving more.
Right.
Because especially guiding, even though I don't take on any clients until close to the rut, I have a ton of work to do as far as, I said this year, we're probably going to run 100 cameras. So I got to move all those cameras, and it's not like it takes one day to move 100 cameras. You're talking
Right.
3 or 4 weeks,
Right.
at least. So I got to get all those cameras moved. I got to get all, roughly maybe 50 stands moved, try to find time to hunt. So unfortunately, the early season isn't a time when I'm out there hunting every day. But when a big front or something passes through, then it's like that's my day off.
Right.
That's just too good to not hunt. That time of year. So,
Right, and then you have all the intel from the scouting that you've done as well because you spent so much time, boots on the ground.
Yep. No, and even though it seems like I got a ton of bucks located, over the summer, which I do, but 90% of those bucks are going to shift and be doing something completely different than what they did in the summer. So I'm also trying to figure out those things. I got to still find where the food sources are, and let's not forget does either. I got to figure out what the does are doing before the rut starts as well. So there's just so much scouting that you have to do in preparation, early season that unfortunately, or maybe it's not unfortunate, but I just know some guys love the early season. I have to prepare more for the rut and when my clients come.
Right. So two more questions for this early season section, and this one I think is interesting because I think it'll help give people some context. So give me a successful hunt that you had during the early part of the season that kind of comes to mind for you.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, one of my favorite ones was it wasn't the biggest deer. It was probably like a 110, 115 inch 8-point, but I watched this buck all summer, and I was 18 years old. I was just starting to get into trying to hunt, more mature deer. It was probably only 3 or 4 year old buck, and to some people, they would think, well, that's why is he talking about that? Well, a 3 or 4 year old buck in public land, big woods, especially 12 years or 13 years ago, or I think it was even long. Actually, I'm 34 now and talking about when I'm 18, so it's more like 16. But
right.
It's amazing how time flies.
Exactly.
But anyways, why I really like that hunt especially is, so I knew the buck was going to shift, and I was new to the area, but what I ended up doing was I found 3 or 4 different spots where I hung stands and to try to even pinpoint where he was going to shift more towards bedding than anything. And so I got in, I got in that stand and hunted it like once. Nothing happened. It was back then. I didn't run a whole lot of cameras. There really wasn't even many cameras back then as it is.
Mm-hmm.
But I kept seeing sign around my stand. I was on the edge of this bedding area, and I just was confident that it was him. But I'd hunted it morning, I hunted it evening, and nothing worked. Well, I did the complete opposite of probably what anyone would do. I said, you know what? Today I'm going to hunt from 10 to 2. So I got in my stand at 10 o'clock, and that buck came out of that bedding area at 11 in the middle of the day. This was like the second or third day of archery season. And what I think I learned about that, which makes it really unique, is that cut there that I was hunting, there was also a cut on the backside of me about 30 yards. And what I believe happened was that buck got up, fed a little bit, and he was going to move into the other cut to lay down the rest of the day. And, you hear so much about early season, like you hunt the first couple hours of the morning, last couple hours of the evening, when I did the complete opposite in a big wood situation, and I think that was probably going to be one of the only ways to kill that buck, because what I believe was going on is he was getting in that bedding area probably well before daylight, and I think he was laying there till about 10, 11, noon, and then that would be his time to get up for a little bit, and then he'd move to another bed, which was that other cut behind me. So it's not the biggest or best deer I've ever killed, but I like that hunt one of the most, because I just feel I did something like way out of the ordinary, and that was probably the best move you could make on that particular situation.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes you got to kind of get outside the box a little bit. You know what I mean? It's, especially for, early season, I feel like, cause if, especially if you don't have something that's working a definitive bed to food pattern, it's so hard to beat them back to bed in the morning, during early season, unless you get, the right kind of moon, if that's something that people follow or whatever, maybe you have a better opportunity or whatever the case is. But, those morning hunts, unless you really know where he's at, it's hard.
Oh yeah. And I just want to bring up that, in especially in a big wood situation, obviously these deer aren't just laying in their bed all day, just sleeping or not moving. I think they get up more often than what people think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you could catch a buck by total surprise by hunting him at like a midday hour. Maybe that buck was even on to me a little bit and was, he might have sensed that I was hunting there in the evening and in the morning. And I wouldn't count out middle of the day if you're close to bedding, really anywhere as well. But I just think in the big woods, like sometimes the food is more scattered and sporadic, and it's not like a pattern where a buck knows he's going to that bean field every night, because he can get his full 9 or 10 pounds of food every day easily. Big wood steer sometimes has got to work more to fill his belly.
Right.
So I think you can have a little more midday activity, because he just can't lay there that long on an empty stomach.
Right. Do you pay attention to the moon at all? Like, is that something you follow?
I've been following it more and more, and I'd like to even get into, take it more seriously. I'm not going to say that I will bank on it. Like, I'm one of them people, I don't really follow what other people do. Like, I got to try it out for myself before I take it seriously. And I've paid attention to it to a certain point where I think that, I think it makes somewhat of a difference, but I haven't seen where like you can totally rely on the moon. But I think what I want to do this year, and I'm not so much going to hunt around it, but I want to kind of keep like, with the 100 cameras that are going to be out there, I want to keep like moon data, especially for myself, and then maybe do that for a few years, then look back and according to my data, really try to see, how much of an effect it does play. But from my experience so far, I don't think like, I see more influence with weather than I do moon.
Right. Yeah. It was a couple years ago I first started paying attention to it, and there was one season that I won't say religiously hunted with it, but really paid attention to like the red moon or the overhead and underfoot moon and stuff like that. And I saw it work out to a T once where it's like it
Oh,
literally
really?
like, yeah. But that was the only time. And then so I kind of gave up on it. It wasn't until recently I've been talking to our buddy Chad more and more
Yep.
about moon, and more so paying attention to just like the, 3 days prior to a full moon and then the 3 days after a full moon.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And kind of like playing that on like, the 3 days prior, the morning, 3 days after, you want to prioritize evenings just because you might
Sure.
get them up out of bed a little bit early, or you might get them coming later to bed, a little bit or whatever, based on how much
Absolutely.
light there was during either the morning or the evening time.
Sure.
So that's one thing I'm going to probably pay a little bit more attention to this year. Kind of like you, it's like I need to see it work before I'm going to,
Exactly.
adopt it full on. But I'll be curious this year to see, because there are a couple really good moon days that I would like to
Oh,
hunt.
yeah.
And I think too, it's like part of the reason why I may not have seen it play out as well is whenever I was using it, that was really prior to me focusing on hunting more around beds. And I'm
Yep.
now curious to see, it's like now that I'm getting closer to bed, because it's like, yeah, you may not see that deer if you're only going to get an extra half hour of movement, but if you're 100
Yep.
yards off of his bed and he gets up a half hour early, well,
Oh, yeah.
that's a big difference. You know what I
Oh,
mean? That's getting an arrow
Yep.
in him and or not, So
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm totally not against it, because I know it has somewhat of an influence, but then when I know for sure that, okay, even I do have obviously some limited hunting time, even early season. So when I know for sure that a cold front is going to get the majority of these mature bucks on their feet, I'm definitely going to spend those days, waiting on a cold front rather than a moon, when I'm just not quite sure I can bank on that.
right.
But totally not against it, and I would encourage anyone to consider trying it. That's
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. If it works for you, keep doing it. That's my philosophy.
Exactly.
So
Yep.
with that, man, if we could just boil it down to Steve Sherk's 3 most important tips for hunting early season, what would your 3 tips for the folks out there listening be?
Sure. Okay. I would say number one is, I notice it around here, and I'm sure it's the same case everywhere. Is I feel like people, they go into hunting season, and it's almost like I got to get it done opening day. And even though you might be asking me for a tip for early season, well, I think one of the biggest tips would be, remember you have the whole season. There's a lot of guys that, and women too, they go out and they're so anxious. They've scouted all summer, some all year, and they go out the first week and they burn themselves out. So I think the number one key is don't burn yourself out. Remember, remember that it's early season, and that's why especially in Pennsylvania, a lot of other states, you got like this year almost 2 months pretty much of bow hunting. So don't burn yourself out early. I would also suggest, if you have if you have the time and the flexibility, especially around your work, number 2 would be hunt when the conditions are at their best. Not like I'm just gonna, hunt whenever it feels right. No, hunt when the weather's right. If you can bank on the wind, hunt when the wind's right. Hunt when all of a sudden you get some good intel on your camera. So try to plan your hunts early season when opportunities are at their best, because I think early season is most challenging, because that's when you have minimal daylight mature buck activity, versus in the rut, bucks are moving all day every day a lot of times.
Right.
So that'd be number 2. And then, like I said earlier, number 3 would be, if you're a listener from a big woods or mountain type area, especially here in PA, I would totally focus more around bedding than food, just for the fact that, from my experience and more running cameras than anything, I run even a lot of cameras around food sources, even though I know that, I'm probably not going to kill one there. But the cameras over time prove that, killing a buck over food in the early season, at least where I'm from, is very, very less odds rather than killing one, around bedding. I've even found some bucks have bedded up to a mile from where they feed every night. So focus along the bedding as best as you can. Hunt when the conditions are right early season, and then just don't burn yourself out too early. I think those would be my 3 tips.
Awesome, man. Well, I think we covered everything for early season. Is there anything that we missed that you wanted to add, or we feel like we covered that pretty good?
No, I really do.
Cool.
Other than, I'm just dying to get out there. I can't believe how fast the season's approaching, I'm excited for Pennsylvania this year.
Well, before we wrap this session up, if you wouldn't mind, Steve, let folks out there know where they can find out more about you and follow you.
Sure. Most people find me on social media, either on Facebook or Instagram. It's Sherk's Guide Service, SHERK''S Guide Service, or you can contact me at my website. It's sherksguideservice.com.
All right. Awesome. Thanks for joining, man.
All right. Thanks a lot, bud.
All right, folks, that is a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank all of you for listening. If you haven't yet, please head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast. And hell, while you're at it, head over to YouTube and give us a sub there as well. I'd be super appreciative if you do those couple things for me. And before I shut this thing down, I need to give a big shout out to our partners who continue to help us make this podcast possible. Tethered, Exodus Outdoor Gear, Skull Brew Coffee Company, and Maven Optics. And until next time, we'll see y'all.